Firstly, we are going to recall the last poem that we studied, which was Living Space. Try to recall the full quotations from the key words. Even better, consider what the quotations mean. And even better still, use the quotations to help you to retell the story of the poem, considering the 5 W's. Emily Dickinson spent many years as a social recluse, isolated from the rest of the world. Not only this, but she'd suffered a lot of grief in her life. So it makes sense that her poem, As Imperceptibly as Grief, is a poem about grief and isolation. In this poem, she also appears to mistrust time. Time passes quickly and it brings with it loss and change. It's clear that Dickinson, having lost people in her life, appears to fear death and the feeling of loss. So I'd like you to consider a couple of questions that might make you think about this poem more carefully before we start to read it. What feelings are associated with grief? Look at the images and think about what they might mean. What might it feel like to be isolated from the rest of the world? And also think about time. Can time be a healer? And can time bring change and loss? If we think about these questions, we really will start to think about some of the key themes in this poem. As Imperceptibly as Grief is one of the more difficult poems in the anthology. So before we start to read, familiarise yourself with some of the words that are a little bit more tricky, that make this poem more difficult. This will help you to understand the poem as we read it. As imperceptibly as grief, the summer lapsed away. Too imperceptible at last to seem like perfidy. A quietness distilled as twilight long begun, or nature spending with herself sequestered afternoon. The dusk drew earlier in, the morning foreign shone, a courteous yet harrowing grace, as guest that would be gone. And thus, without a wing or service of a keel, our summer made her light escape into the beautiful. So let's take a look at the who, what, when and where for this poem. What is this poem about? Well, it's about grief and isolation and how this can affect one's state of mind. This could be why the poem is so disorientating. It jumps from twilight to afternoon to dusk to morning, representing a mind consumed by grief and isolation, perhaps. The setting is the speaker's mind and the tone is clearly melancholy. But this poem could also be about time and how, like the changing seasons, time brings gradual change, which could be both positive and negative, and both mistrustful and healing. So let's take a closer look at the key quotations and their meaning. These are the quotations that help us to tell the story of this poem. So right at the start of the poem, we have the summer lapsed away. This shows how subtly time is drifting away and taking with it summer with the change in seasons. Summer could have positive connotations. We associate summer with lovely sunshine, going out for walks, doing nice things outdoors. And so this could represent how happiness is disappearing as she continues her slide into depression. In the middle of the poem, we have "As twilight long begun." Now, twilight's a really interesting word choice because twilight is that in-between bit between day and night. This could indicate a feeling of being trapped in isolation and depression, being consumed by the grief that is felt. The idea of long begun suggests a sense of longevity. This is a feeling that has been long felt, and perhaps this could indicate the fact that she's been in isolation for so long as well. At the end of the poem, we have "Our summer made her light escape into the beautiful." The ability to escape suggests freedom and release, which might suggest a slightly positive end to the poem, perhaps. But note how the word summer has returned here, perhaps suggesting the idea of things become renewed and come back again, like the passing seasons that come back every year. The return of summer, allowing the release to occur, perhaps indicates an acceptance of loss or a readiness to move on into heaven. However, the poem's tone still remains one of melancholy, and we do have to remember that this is still a poem about grief. So we're now going to address the why of the poem to complete our 5 W's. This should address why the writer created this poem, and this should be the cleverest and best thing you can say about this poem. What was their message? What was their lesson to their readers? Ask yourself, why did the poet write this poem? What is the poet saying about grief and loss? And what does it tell us about grief and loss? So for our final task, try to recall the quotations using the key words: summer, twilight, escape. Try to think about what these quotations actually mean, and even better still, think about how they relate to the poem's story. Really think about the 5 W's.